Hello and welcome everyone in another episode of Researcher Celebrity. Today we have Dr. Jessica Kurylo with us, okay? And a brief introduction about her. She has two bachelors, one in soils and another one in environmental sciences from Virginia Tech, United States. For masters, she attended University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign and studied natural resources and environmental sciences. Then she flew all over the globe and then joined PhD in ecology at University of Melbourne in Australia. And after that, she has done so many things which we are going to have conversation with her in this. So with this brief introduction, I would welcome Jessica at the platform. Jessica, thank you.
Thank you, Raja. Thank you for having me.
So we always start our conversation with the traditional question that how and when you decided that you want to become a researcher.
That's I don't that's a funny thing. And I meant to go find this picture that my mom has of me from when I was a kid. Apparently, when I got um my bachelor's, well, I'm sorry. Yeah, when I got my bachelor's, my mom gave me this card with this picture from when I was like a little kid, and it was me digging in the dirt. And she was just like, "Oh, it seems pretty appropriate that, you got a bachelor's degree in soils because this is basically what we saw from you as a kid constantly was always making mud pies and always decorating them with marigolds and digging in the dirt and digging in grandma's potted plants and digging and all kinds of stuff." So it seems, perhaps in some way I've always been a scientist who likes to get dirty. Um, but I don't really, I guess that would be, I don't really know if I have like an exact moment. I got very lucky. I didn't really do research outside of classes in college, in my undergrad, I should say. And then I took a job after that at the University of Illinois. So I was actually working there concurrently as I got my master's, but I was working as a wetland soil scientist. And a lot of the guys, I was the only one who didn't have a master's degree. And a lot of the guys were doing side research. Well, I shouldn't say that. I was not the only one. Most of my group had master's degrees also. And they were kind of doing like some really interesting things. They did a lot of floral surveys. Some of them were getting into doing other stuff. But I was at what is actually called the Illinois Natural History Survey. And we have it's an amazing conglomerate of all kinds of researchers who do all kinds of really cool things. I was a technical scientist there. I was on a grant, on a contract to do wetlands work for the Illinois Department of Transportation. But then we were at this really cool institute where they had, and still, I mean, it's the institute's, 125, 140 years old, something like that. But they have all kinds of neat people doing all kinds of really neat things, from mammalogists to a guy who studied worms to one of the world's leading experts in the whole Rosaceae family, to a guy who studied, mites and flies. He studied flies and the genitalia of flies in particular, because that's how you sex them. And he was always interesting to talk to, but it was also kind of like, that's some crazy stuff. But you get kind of really interested in that, probably from that environment, I think, is what got me interested in things. But my first foray into real research was actually an applied science question. Which was around, sorry, I best had to think through this. There's a plant called Rhamnus cathartica, common buckthorn. It's an invasive, non-native invasive species here in the United States. In certain parts of the country, you can find it basically from Maine down to, I think there's some in Maryland. I would know. I would have to check Kurylo et al. 2007 to double check this. I haven't looked at it in a while. But but then out into the Midwest and up into Canada and stuff is the extent of this plant. But for our work doing wetland stuff, we couldn't call some of these areas wetlands, despite the fact that they had, so to be a wetland, you have to have three parts. You have to have soils, plants, and hydrology. You have to meet those three things that are laid out by the Corps of Engineers 1987 manual. And there was a lot of areas that we couldn't call wetlands because we didn't meet all three. And that was because we had this plant, Rhamnus cathartica, growing on them. we had incredibly wet soils. I mean, in some cases they were organic on top, you'd have water sitting on them. It's just like, you can't get more everything else wetland than this, but we had this plants on there. So I kind of got interested in wanting to look into this, because I was just like, this is holding us up. These areas are clearly wetlands. Just because this plant's growing there, like, what the hell's going on? So that was probably my actual foray into that. And I don't know if, like, if I had been at a consultant working, I don't know if I would have been as encouraged or had the time to really start looking into this, and had people around me who were just like super smart. I worked with a lot of like really incredibly smart people. And I guess I kind of took my lead from them in terms of starting to look into this. And so that was actually my foray into doing research, was more asking an applied question, or looking into an applied question and problem that was affecting my work, and then basically producing a master's degree from that. I was encouraged by my coworkers after about a year of fumbling around and trying to sort some things and trying to understand, not knowing how to do research at all, really. And they encouraged me. They're like, Jesse, you're doing all this stuff. You're putting all these things together. Why don't you go and talk to, Dr. Andres? He seems like he'd probably be a really good candidate for you to go get a master's with. He likes doing applied stuff. He's over at NRES. And then it was just history from there. Like, I got into the program, and he liked what I was already working on. And then we came up with a couple other more concerted like research projects and stuff within that. And then that's how I did my master's. So that was my first foray into doing like real research on my own. Probably though, along the lines, and I couldn't be more specific in terms of like trying to remember, but like they often needed hands with things. So like you were going out and helping the other guys with like their projects. Again, I did so much of these things over the 13 years that I was there. I don't remember when it all started, but I certainly was kind of, like a hand, like an extra hand to do something, or an extra person to, do this, in terms of like doing people's research projects. But at the same time, my own job was going out and, looking at the soils and understanding, having to have a really good understanding of, why are these soils forming like this in a landscape context based on, in really dry years, is this really a hydric soil? Is this not a hydric soil? Which seems like a simple question, but sometimes isn't. And trying to kind of like pull all of these things together to kind of come out with a really good outcome, especially in say like a dry year or an extra wet year. Like, yeah, there's like a foot of water on here, but these plants aren't really wet, and this soil is really the wrong color, so there's the science, there's a technical science side of what I was doing at the same time. And then yeah, just kind of it's kind of hard. It was so long ago too. It was like 25 years ago, 23 years ago, 24, I don't know. 2000 is when all this started, 24 years ago. It's kind of hard to remember how it all kind of played out, but I was certainly helping with people's research projects. We were certainly, having to do wetland monitoring and mitigation stuff. So, you have to really read into and understand the science behind all those things to understand, like when you're making your recommendations or you're trying to interpret what you're seeing, that you can, understand what's going on. So it was very science heavy position, but I don't really know where the research started in on that. But you had to read other research that was going. You had to understand where these things were coming from, and then within that, I did my master's. Yeah, and then it just kept going with it, and yeah, I just kept going with it. I did those, and we did, I don't know how many. I did a couple of different sub projects with the Ramnus. I did another research study after that. I'm not going to say I did a great job of it, but I did okay. But then for me, I guess the kindest way to put it would be like, for me to grow, I needed to leave for a variety of reasons. I needed to leave where I was at. There wasn't, yeah. It just, you get to a point where you just kind of like, I'm not going to continue to grow here under these conditions. So I needed to go. I never, ever, 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 ever thought I would ever do a PhD. I never wanted to do a PhD. It just happened to be that I am a very adventurous person who likes to travel. And I concocted this crazy idea based on, all right, yeah, I had a friend who, because again, we had all kinds of amazing people where I worked. and it's actually a really good friend of mine who just went to Europe for a month so that he can teach zoology, animal husbandry to people over there. So this particular friend got a 6-month contract doing bird work in Australia. And as part of that, the people who are in charge of that told him that if he wanted to go on and do a PhD, that the data that he was collecting on this contract that he had for them, that he could use that, and that they have a whole big setup thing that you can just come in, I don't know, they work it out so that for international students, to be able to come in and do PhDs. And I was like, oh, isn't that so cool? Thought it was really neat. Anyway, it was just very random happened circumstance. That same summer, I went to ESA. It was held in Portland, and I went and listened to a talk on green roofs. For a variety of reasons, it was something I was interested in. I had this crazy idea, which also was kind of part of the talk. I had a similar idea about, could we use green roofs for like rare plant conservation? Because in Illinois there was like dryland plants, and I was like, well, wouldn't that be neat? You could put them up there, and then things wouldn't be stepping on them or trying to eat them and what have you, and whatever. Anyway, but this dude from Australia was talking, and so I just on a whim like contacted him about potentially doing green roof research and getting a PhD. And he was just like, well, I have no funding, but if you can get in and you can get a scholarship, sure. And I was like, so off I went. So yeah, I became an international student and did my PhD over there. I ended up not doing green roofs. Was I ended up looking at butterflies. Oh, sorry. I used butterflies to look at ecosystem services across urban landscapes is what I did. And which I know has not much to do with green roofs, but anyone who's done a PhD, or at least a lot of us, particularly maybe in ecology, you know what I'm talking about. This is what I'm gonna do. Oh, that's what I've done. It's
That's
just
how it all starts.
I don't know if it works the same for like lab settings. Like I've known a few people who came in and were just like, this is what I'm doing, and that is what they did. And I just was like, wow, that's crazy, because this is where I started, and that is totally not what I did.
So you followed the path which they say 98% of the researchers follow. But yes, there are 2% or 10% of researchers which have everything in their mind before they start the project. That this is how they will start, this is how they will end. But yeah, absolutely. This is so after traveling from this part of the world, United States, to Australia for the PhD, which as you said, has not gone the way you wanted it to be. So
Well,
let's
I had no expectations. I on it, like anyone who's asked me, I'm like, I went for the adventure.
Mhm.
And I did a PhD on the side.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a great way to look at it. So because this is researchers celebrities, we celebrate research here. So let's talk about the challenges of research you have faced in United States and Australia.
Oh, well, I had to learn how to drive a car on the wrong side of the road while on the wrong side of the car. And I also had to shift it, which I already knew how to drive. I knew how to drive stick, but I had to do it with the other arm. I had to do it in the wrong lane. I had to learn how to do these hook turns while in Melbourne. There was some crazy stuff. Had to learn how to brave big spiders. And yeah, that was some of it. So that's actually a really interesting question, because as much as I had already worked at university for 13 years before I started my PhD. And you would think that most unis in a way kind of are similar. And in some ways, all the politicking is the same. And space fights, again, anyone who's worked in academia, you get that one. And all the funding fights and all the jazz like that. But then there was still a lot of cultural norms that you have to learn, which that I want to put this out here. Anyone who does a PhD, anyone who probably comes to school, even if you come as an undergrad or a master's and you're doing this in another language, Jesus Louise, good on you. Good on you. I spoke English, but I didn't speak Australian.
Mhm.
Um, and like for me, I think I had an easy way with that because for me, my international experience was in a country that wasn't too dissimilar from America, especially since they're very America loving.
Mhm.
Um, but there was a lot of certain things. It was very interesting to have that experience. I I guess, yeah. So there was some like cultural stuff. I don't know how much you want me to go into some of those things. Some of the things were just like really very randomly. Um,
We will.
as an American, you're loved and hated.
So that's
um,
part of the
and
thing.
then
Whenever we talk about researchers moving continents from one to another one, so there are two basic things which we try to discuss. Is one, the change in the research organization. Like somewhere it is so easy that you have a central stock room, you just go and take whatever reagents you want. That is the easier part. The tough part is, as you said, the cultural shock. People,
yeah.
especially when they are going for either undergrads, masters, or graduate PhD at a longer, a run, how homesick you were because you were there for an adventure and just took your PhD on a side. So,
Well,
were
yeah.
you ever homesick?
I wish. Actually, I was not.
Mm,
For me, I had already moved. I moved out of my house when I was 18. Went off to college, did 5 years, for my undergrad. Had been I spent time, so I paid for school through the National Guard. So like I paid for school on my own. So I joined the Army and I used what we call the Montgomery GI Bill and I paid for school as a National Guardsman. And so I left home and I didn't really come back.
mhm,
Um, Especially after my sophomore year. I think I spent the first 2 summers back here working to earn the money to pay for school, to pay for my undergrad. Because as a lot of people know, I mean, I know that some countries it's free to go to school
mhm,
or not as expensive, but in America, you could go into massive debt trying to go to school.
mhm,
Back when I went, it wasn't as bad as the astronomical prices today, but it was still really expensive for me. My parents did set aside money so that I could go to my first 2 years, but then I joined the National Guard to pay for school. So I was really kind of out of the house a long time ago. And then I lived in Illinois. So Illinois from New Jersey, where all of my family lived, was 13 hours. So I came home maybe once a year and saw
mhm.
my family. So I didn't really experience home
Homesick.
homesickness.
Okay.
Yeah, I really like when I moved to Australia, there was certain and I had a lot of good friends. I mean, I think there's the things that you miss. Like I lost my grandma.
Mhm,
We thought we were gonna lose my grandpa. Uh, so I mean, my grandma, I said goodbye. We knew that was kind of gonna come. So I went home after 2.5 years. Um, and so I got to say goodbye to my grandma then. When we thought we were losing my grandpa, like I flew home. I did, it didn't matter. Had a credit card, went for it. Financially, I was also in a very different position, probably from most students. So that kind of just puts me in a slightly different category. I think like I kind of the way I looked at certain things, was very blessed as far as that goes. I had sold my house here in the States, so I had, there, not to say that I, was doing well. I mean, I lived on my stipend and stuff, but when there was emergencies or something, like I could whip out my credit card and that, I wasn't going to suffer. So I was able to like come home. It was very expensive, but I, came home to see him. But um, I like it is different, right? Like, cause it's just weird that you lose people and you're not there for it. There is that aspect of any person who's gone international for things, but I think any immigrant also feels that probably. Um, Not that I was an immigrant, but I was working on it. Um, and Yeah, there's a lot of those things. As far as the structural research, structural parts, for me, it wasn't entirely different. Like it was everything I expected because I had been around the university. It was kind of like the same BS. You just had to figure out who to talk to, who to order the car from, what was your grant numbers, all of that stuff. That was the same. I mean, it wasn't that different. But just, yeah, more of the cultural things, like how do you talk to people? What is your place? Because you go for me, I went from being a staff member at a university to a student, which puts you, lower on the hierarchy. And yeah, like those types of things, I think were the bigger things for me. As a field ecologist, I didn't have to worry about where was I going to get my reagents from and like that kind of stuff. For me, it was, all right, what are the rules that around how I'm allowed to be in a town? Like how do people react to that? When I worked in Illinois, I had what we called I had my staff member card for the Department of Natural Resources, which basically gave me permission to go anywhere I wanted. Not that we did, we asked permission usually, but I had that ability. I also had a vehicle available to me to use for research if I wanted outside of our contract work. We were allowed to use the vehicles. If no one else was using them, we could, do that. So that was always a free resource to me. The research that I had done, for my master's and stuff, I always did it on the side of my contract work, right? So for me, like having to now actually navigate getting money and budgeting it, that was a new aspect for me. But I had so many colleagues that were doing all that stuff. Like I was aware of those conversations, and to me, it was just like I knew I was going to have to do it. So it wasn't that strange or scary to me. So yeah, I guess I was pretty well aware of how that was going to go, or how that should go and how it would look. I didn't know how I was going to get the money, but I wrote for a few grants and stuff and got some money to cover my work.
And very important, and this is something which we always tell to converse with our researchers on this platform, that you know your science, and that is why you have been selected to any university all over different countries, different continents. What you are not very well aware, or most of us are not, at least I was not, when I went to States for the first time, I had no clue. The way what I say in India is the same way you say the things, and then it has a total different meaning. And then I struggled there. And you also said that you also had to learn all of those. Either it is cultural shock or it is about the driving on a different part, and you said wrong. And I was like, why they're driving it opposite? Well, then it comes the research part in there, that we are here to do our research. But what is equally important is that we are human beings. We are here to be happy, not suffering. Because, okay, so now let's talk to the second question, that your thoughts about research bringing the stress.
So what was stressful about doing research, or what is stressful in general about doing research? Is
Yes.
that what you're essentially asking?
Yeah.
It's a great question. I think that, that pressure that's on you to have an outcome, have an outcome, and sometimes what that outcome is going to be. I feel like, and probably a lot of other people who do the PhD, I don't know if so much on the backside of doing research. I felt like when I did my postdoc, it was just kind of like, I'm going to get something, I'm going to get some kind of results. I set myself up to, kind of collect all this field data, come up with all this basic research for these sites, because I thought that there was going to be more funding afterwards, which didn't materialize. So I was doing like all of this like basic, floral stuff, and I just had my soils paper published out of that. I still have the other things. I still have a lot of other things to write up, but I feel like when you step into the PhD, that was kind of more stressful, because you're not really sure. You're being trained as a researcher, right? That's what the PhD is. It is basically like an internship to being a researcher. And while I myself was comfortable with some of the mechanics on how that happens, I think that there's just more pressure. And even like I would say, I felt a lot more pressure as like an international student, as American, I felt like there was like this extra pressure on me because like people are like, oh, you're an American, like, like, yeah, that's where I get my attitude from. Like, I'm also from Jersey. Um, but uh it, that was just far more stressful. It's I think it's because it's the first time you're doing like a really big research project. I don't know if Raja, you felt the same way. Like there was just this enormity to that. Like I just felt like so much was on my shoulders and on my back in performing because I was this older person. I was an American. I was, like all these things. And I just felt like a lot more pressure to have to perform. And I don't really want to get too much into like the journey of my particular PhD and my feelings about it. But that, yeah, there was just a lot of stuff going on in the first part of my PhD in the first 2 years. And that was a lot more stress, but not all of it was the research itself. There was a lot of other things that were happening. And yeah, there was just like I just felt like more of like a pressure to perform and understanding how it was going to come together. At the same time, I was happy I had a supervisor and then I got another supervisor whom I don't know, like I guess to me I just had an inherent trust in both of those two ladies and I I felt like they weren't going to let me fail, right? If that makes sense. Like I was lucky in that respect as much of a grumpy time as I was having with other things like, Kara just being like, you're gonna get something, don't worry. Like we got a good design. just keep going at it. Just keep doing it. Just keep doing it. We'll figure it out. We've got a good sampling design. We just need the data. Um, that was stressful. And then there's other little things. I guess like you can start talking about the minute things. When you are a field ecologist and you are using a bug, like butterflies, like I did, there's just really specific sampling conditions. And so that became a bit stressful. I was like, am I going to be able to I had 100 sites. I had to hit them twice in a year. I also had this subset of an additional 15 sites that had like, we were doing gardening sampling in those. And it was, am I going to get enough people to let me onto their property? Am I going to get enough days in? Oh my God, like I rented the car for the day and I forget how much it cost me out of my grant for that. But, what if I have the car and the wind doesn't die down? It turns out that the BOM app for the phone is fantastic. If it says that the sky is going to clear at 11:45, that sky is starting to clear at 11:43. That was great. But I still had to constantly be checking 3 weather apps because the logistics for my project, I covered the whole area of Melbourne. It was a 14K wide area. And, we sample here one day, I would sample here the next day, I'd sample here the next day, sample here that day, so I had to move around. I had to have so many sites a day prepped and ready to go. I always had a couple sets of sites, ready out of my 100. If there was going to be a homeowner thing, I would always have to call the homeowner a day in advance. So then you're always like stressing the weather, but yeah, that was probably like the more stressful part, of it, like as far as the actual research goes. But, if you're doing lab work, it's probably not that bad. Weather doesn't affect you. You don't have to make sure that you're, over 10 kilometers of wind and under 25 and the temperature is this and it's after this time and before that time and identifying 480 flowering plants in your sampling area and that are no longer just American plants that you kind of knew. Suddenly you're learning all of the really cool landscape plants that come in from where the heck is that? Africa, from the Finbas. So it was like, yeah, at the same time, it was just like a cool adventure for me. It was stressful as hell, but and I certainly didn't travel nearly as much. I know I went for the adventure and I was going to do the PhD on the side, but it was just like I didn't travel much. I am an American who is a workaholic, so I mostly worked. Um,
So
but that
I
was the stress, I would say.
Yeah, so so stress is inherent. Either you are in field or in lab. I can speak for the second part. I have done a lot of that part. So now the faith in PI, how important is this for a PhD student who's either because you were well trained, like as you mentioned, 13 years in university before joining your PhD, but not most of the students go that way. Most of them
No.
get bachelor's, master's, or directly to the PhD, the graduate school. So how important is this for you to have faith in your advisor? Because that's what you said. It was integral for you. They had faith in you, you had faith in them. And that was very important.
I think you would not finish if you didn't have faith in your advisor and if they didn't have faith in you.
Right.
The PhD, and I think even your actual research. So I know we were talking. I know I got stuck in the loop on my PhD, but I would say I had a lot of the same excitement and stresses in my postdoc too. I had a huge, spatially huge, and logistically pretty big postdoc also, where I did a lot of field work. It was a lot of the same stresses, logistics. But in both of these, I think that I had supervisors who were hands-on. Well, yeah. If you weren't feeling supported by your supervisor, I think in either one of those, you wouldn't, I don't think you could finish. Um, maybe some people could. I couldn't have. Um, yeah, I don't think if I hadn't had Kara and uh if my other supervisor hadn't come along, I don't know if I would have finished.
So
I was ready to quit at two different times for various reasons I don't want to get into. But I like if it wasn't for them, and if it wasn't for them, kind of being like, you got this, we're gonna be okay. You're gonna be okay. We're gonna, help you get to the end on this. If it wasn't for them, I don't think it is. And I think if especially as an international student and you are far away from home, and while yes I didn't get homesick, but this still doesn't mean that I didn't have my support system around me, right? I didn't have my good friends that I had garnered for those years living in Illinois. I didn't have my cousins. I didn't have my sister. I mean, yeah, I did. Call her up,
mhm.
but you don't have that support system. And so if I would, to me, I would think it's just really hard to be able to finish if you don't have a support system. Now, outside of that, I would say if other people in the department, or if you had a lab that had a lot of students in it, and like a really good postdoc or somebody who, runs the lab, who's, looking out for you and helping you, and, you're feeling support in some way, I think that's important. So maybe if your supervisor isn't doing that, but, other people in the lab are, you could get to the end. But I don't, like, I just don't know. I mean, that journey is such a lonely journey.
Mhm.
And it's such an emotional journey. And if you haven't done a PhD, you don't understand that. But it is like this massively emotional journey. And I have a will of steel of getting things done and whatnot, but that was a doozy, to do it. But yeah, I don't know if you could. And then my postdoc, my supervisor was hands off. I mean, he was great though. I mean, like when I needed to talk, we talked and that kind of stuff. So I mean, he was there to support me when I needed it, when and if I reached out for it. Um, and yeah, I guess in my particular postdoc, I just needed that kind of support. Like I was ready to rock and roll with all the stuff I had. Once I hit the ground, I was running, I was off, but I just needed some support. Um, and he was there, and he's been there like when we do things. So he is still supportive in the same way. Um, but yeah, I think it's massively important. I mean, in yours, you were telling me about your PhD supervisor, and I thought that was great. Like, but would you feel the same way? Like, do you also
Yeah.
think that you need that?
And in fact, this is one thing which I would like to tell all the audience here, that what Jessica is telling us, that if you and faith is both ways. Like in here, if you don't have faith in your PI or the advisor doesn't have it in you, it is really tough for taking or accomplishing the PhD, because what has been seen that people after spending 3 years, 4 years, 5 years sometime in India, they drop out of their PhDs, which I see is very sad, and in very rare cases they do commit suicide, which is absolutely not acceptable in any sense. Either you are a researcher or you are doing anything. This is not what you should never consider that as an option, because it is not an option. The option is to talk about your feelings, being vocal, as just mention about the support system. It is so important because not every day is good. Not every day the publications are accepted. Most of them go through revision, rejection, everything. But what is more important, that you should be there, because that is what makes you happy.
Yeah.
You think that research is not making you happy, probably it is not for you, and there is nothing wrong in accepting it. We have seen PhDs taking out the degrees and then never do research. They do whatever else they want to do, which is totally fine. Why? The one of the reasons behind having this researcher celebrity series is because Empowering Science Foundation believe in breaking the barriers, and one of the barrier is that researchers are not celebrated enough. So we are doing the celebration of research at this series. And today, Jessica, we have you here. I would like to ask you that you moved from United States to Australia for your PhD, came back, and now after spending so many years in research, what is one thing which you can say that still is driving you crazy about your research?
I don't do research anymore.
Mm-hmm.
I don't. I had to be, I guess I was off track during COVID, essentially.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I'll just be blunt about that. I mean, it's something that we should also talk about. I mean, I think it's really important. I had to leave academia.
Mm-hmm.
I couldn't find couldn't find work. It's not to say that my work was poor. It makes you feel like that. I mean, anyone else who's had to get out of academia or whatnot, some of you might feel like, well, why are my ideas not good enough? I'll just be blunt. I was not particularly good at getting funding. Um, so that combined with COVID and I guess there's just way too many of us in general, because any postdoc I applied for, like when I would follow up with them, they had 30 or 40 applications for the postdocs. So it's like you have to make a decision. Like, okay, I love doing this. I really like doing this. I enjoy the challenge. I love the challenge. I love piecing it together. I like learning new things in R. I love learning new things, period. I still drive my coworkers nuts with that, because I need to be a nerd and I need to learn things constantly and figure it out and how does it work and all this stuff, which I think is what drives you during the PhD, right? That constant curiosity is what gets you through. That's what got me through. I am not a smart person. I am a curious person, and I am persistent, and I ask way too many questions, but that's what gets you to the end. Which I think is also important. I really want to put that out there. I mean, you don't have to be smart to finish. You just need to be persistent to get there, and you have to know where you want to go, and you have to kind of try and stay focused, right? But that's I don't do research anymore like that. I'm not in a research position. Would I take one again? I don't 100% know. I don't think I would get picked up because I've not been particularly fast at getting my publications out, and I don't have a good track record on getting funding. And that is, again, I think it's important because most of the people that Raja has had on here all are like, I'm doing this, I'm doing that. Well, there's some of us who haven't. So
Yeah.
it doesn't mean anything about my work. It just means that I happen to slip through the cracks. I'm not particularly good at like some of the networking stuff and whatnot, but that doesn't mean that I'm not you know not as curious and not as interested in doing the research and not as capable. I'm very capable of it. But I don't. I ended up I'll just be completely blunt. I was on unemployment for quite a while and then got picked up entry-level position doing environmental surveys out in the desert for a nonprofit for a while, and then done some other things. Then I had to like more seriously think about, well, what do I want to do? Because obviously all of the jobs I keep applying for as a postdoc or a researcher type position aren't happening. And I ended up having to move back because of family reasons. I ended up having to move back to New Jersey to help out my family. And apparently they just don't hire ecologists out here. So despite continuing to apply for all these ecology postdocs and ecology positions and everything, I didn't get a single phone call. Again, when, and if you would follow up again, it was like, well, we had like 30 applications, and it's like, okay. So now I work in applied sciences. So I work for the Natural Resources Conservation Service, which is part of the USDA, which is a federal agency, and I'm a soil conservationist. So I take all of my knowledge and I help with landowners and farmers to help heal and mitigate for resource concerns on their properties. And I get to kind of dabble into things. Like my boss likes that I'm very willing to jump in and read things and can consolidate information, basically doing really quick literature reviews for stuff. Like when we have, new issues that pop up or something, things that we're looking at or what have you. I can take those skills and do that with it.
And this is,
But
we say
yeah,
that a researcher is always a researcher. You can never say that you
yeah.
don't research anymore, because research ruins you forever. Even probably next, life, you still will be doing research. And one of the things which we always mention is like, when it is about research, you have earned the degree of PhD, which has trained you for the lifetime. So no
Yeah.
matter where you do, where you go, what you do, you always will be a researcher. Probably, as you said, now you are doing more of applied research, which
Yeah.
is part of the fruit which you got your training in all over the world whenever you were a researcher. Now, at the edge of the conversation, I would like to know your thoughts about, yes, let's take a little bit time to talk about this thing, that saying bye to academia is not a bad thing. We always say this, that saying bye to anything is not bad until you are happy doing that. And sometimes your happiness might be changing, and there are success stories that people have changed their career 3 to 4, 5 different times, and then at some point of time they were like, they were doing all of this because they were feeling changed in their emotions. Like, if something makes me feel happy today, doesn't mean I'll do this for the rest of my life. It might not happen, but what is more important is that whatever you are doing should be making you happy, should be making you enthusiastic every morning to go and get out of your bed. That is so important.
Yeah, it is. It totally is. I like that I get to help people. We set up cost share. We try and set up cost share things to help people that are having some pretty big problems. Whether that's, having stormwater issues or erosion. I've been doing a lot of, we had a disaster event here last summer. So I've been working on with those farmers on getting the gullies, healed out of their fields. Um, and we still have some offshoot problems from that. I've been out on that couple of people's properties who have problems that were also related to that event. Kind of talking to them about how can we mitigate this? How can we heal this for this? Working with other natural disaster type things, even though it's slow motion, but we have emerald ash borer here and it's eaten up it's killed most of our ash trees. So, working with, I've been able, to get, help get people some funding to take those trees down so that they're not affecting their hay fields and fence rows and access roads. And, or, the one guy, luckily his horses had been pulled out of that field, but they had a wind shear come across this field right after. It was like a week after I got him some funding to take the trees down. And the two of these, or one of the big trees that came down in this wind shear, this dead ash tree, landed right on the hay feeder for the horses. So, I mean, granted, he had them in the barn at the time, so it wasn't an issue, but it's very relevant, so it feels good. Like that aspect of my job feels good that I'm doing this. Is it using all of my skills? No. Is it scratching, my researcher itch? Not particularly. But it's nice to do things to help people out, especially farmers and landowners. That feels good, and that is important, because if you could be paid all the money in the world and not, and the job not really satisfy you. And I guess, so you were saying you wanted me to mention what I did today. So I also have a part-time job. I've been working for the state park system for 3 years now. It was one of the first jobs I got when I got back into New Jersey. I was able to get on as a seasonal at a state park, and I go out and I do maintenance. I do landscaping stuff with them, mowing lawns, a lot of weed whacking. I have little projects. Since I've been there so long now, I have little projects doing invasive species management for them. I could almost show you, I wore a button-down shirt, but I can show you the massive amount of poison ivy I have on my arm at the moment from pulling Japanese knotweed last week, or cutting it. And it doesn't pay very well, but it's a very satisfying and meditative job. I spent 6.5 hours raking sweet gum balls today, and it was just like the most relaxing.
Yes.
It's very satisfying. It's like, I made this area look really nice. I got paid to be outside all day. I also got pictures of Jack in the pulpits and water leaf and all kinds of other exciting little plants that I didn't know were sitting in the wood line next to our shop. But that's the nerd in me, like I like, doing, that has been really awesome though. Since I moved back to New Jersey, I get to do a lot of plant ID with them. They're giving me other opportunities there to, like I said, do the invasive species work. And I've been running we've been running what we call strike teams. So I think I ran 5 or 6 of them last year, where I had, volunteers came out and helped me pull that. We're talking about, we have an area where we have wisteria. And so we're talking about maybe, tackling that next. So I don't get paid well, but it's enjoyable. It's definitely a very give back kind of thing. And that's important. That's important to have. You need to really enjoy what you're doing, because if you're going to have to continue to get up and do it, you want to make sure that there's something, you need to get something from it besides the paycheck.
So the word of wisdom, this is the time when you guide the next generation of researchers and what they should not do or what they should do.
I say take opportunities when they come. The opportunity to move to Australia and actually go do the PhD. Like I said, I think a year out from that, if you had told me that I was going to do that, I would have been like, and especially the idea of doing the PhD, like that had never, wasn't really part of it. That was just the mode for me to get out of where I was at, so that I could have a growth experience, that I could travel overseas. And I don't regret it one bit. I mean, it was really fantastic. I would say, from my friends whom I have seen be a lot more successful, work on the networking part of things. I was not as strategic, I think, is what I don't think it was a failure. I just think it's my personality, because I didn't really have, when I went and did the PhD, because it wasn't something I wanted to do, I didn't have that ultimate goal like some people did of landing the tenure track position. That was not my goal. I wanted to go, I wanted to do this, I wanted to challenge myself, I wanted to have the adventure. And I probably maybe would have considered a teaching position at a small liberal arts college, but I never wanted to have some big lab. I also I would have absolutely loved kind of gotten on somewhere where I was maybe taken in a little bit more than I was like during my postdoc, and be in a position where like I'm on regular funding, but I'm helping to write stuff, but helping to run like big research projects and, churning out that kind of stuff. That would have been me. I'm just not, I don't have the right personality, I don't think, to be a professor, like that type of person. I'm a field person. And that's kind of where my head was at when I started. So I was not being strategic. I think it's important, because for the folks who I know who landed TT positions and such, you had to be really strategic. You had to be thinking a lot bigger. You had to be doing all of these different things. And that just, it's not where I wanted to go, so I wasn't doing those things. Like, writing the book chapters, writing that stuff. But part of that is that strategic networking. And if that's what your goal is, then you need to be on that. I think that that was definitely very helpful for a lot of people who I know who got positions. And I was just networking in the wrong. Again, I don't know. I had fun. That was what mattered. I had fun and I got stories. But yeah, that would be super important. The other thing is as soon as you get opportunities, get your advisors to start writing grants with you. And start looking for more of that stuff. That's one thing that I had asked for that I don't really feel like I got enough of, and I should have maybe been more assertive about asking for help with those things. I Yeah, I could have used more help. And I would say that some of my friends who I know whom got help, or I don't know if they specifically got help or how it was, but maybe they just found it easier to do those types of things, or maybe the research they were trying to do was more readily funded. If you are a field ecologist, it is not easy to get funding. You almost have to be on these big national grants to fund you. You could find money to pay for the car, to pay for the lab equipment. But if you want to get paid, you want to support yourself on that, it's few and far between to actually find funding to do that. That's kind of where I should say, that's where I kind of just I couldn't get there. I couldn't get those types of grants written. And obviously then if you can't get them written, you can't get them funded. But I could find tons of stuff to actually support the work. But I would say that's super important, and I don't think it should be understated how important it would be to get involved early on in your master's or in your PhD with writing those, so that you know how to do that, so that you can do a better job than like I did, and being able to support yourself if you want to stay into that kind of work. I think that's super important. The strategic networking is super important, and making friends. I think that like that building your support system. I'm not a fan of, like, I know some folks who have been in these labs where it's, dog eat dog. You don't need to be doing that. Like, why, right? We're a team. Let's be a team. Let's get it done. Yes, my project is different from your project, and maybe that comes, I don't know, like people, I just feel like we get farther when we work together. And so make friends, support each other, be there, when the person's project failed, let them talk to you, and that way then you can talk to them. Like, be supportive of each other. There's no reason not to be. Science isn't a like a game for only one person to win. Science benefits everybody. So we should be working together. There's no reason to be tearing each other down. There's no reason to be like blocking people from getting stuff. I've heard these stories about people who work in labs where they like hide each other's pipettes and mess with people's samples and stuff. And Mother Nature messed with mine, but she won and it's all good. I had to start again. She decided to send a hailstorm and broke the windows in the greenhouse where one of my research projects was going on. But I did it again. Probably did it better the second time. I got data. I got my master's. But there's just no reason for that. And that would be another bit of advice. I feel like, having that support system is just uber important. Also, and I would just say, reach out to people around you. And as an international student and one who loves to cook and is very good at it, we found a lot of camaraderie through food during my PhD program. I hosted one, but I went to a couple others where we had these big international dinners, and like the idea was that you had to bring, or themed dinners, but sometimes it was international dinners. Like, you had to bring a food from where you came from, and like I brought peanut butter and jelly one time, or I would have people over for American dinners, or I loved going and going to my different colleagues' houses, getting real Chinese food. Like, I can't eat American Chinese food. It's so hard because I know how good it can be, right? Like, once you've had handmade corn noodles with the stuff and the doodahs, and you're just like, oh, And then they're like, your cousins are like, hey, let's go get Chinese. There's some General Tso's. And you're like, oh,
Yeah.
no, I can't today, because I have standards. But there's no reason. I mean, it was fantastic. I mean, I had Vietnamese colleagues, I had Chinese colleagues, I had Indian colleagues, I had Iranian colleagues. I didn't get to share food with them too much. Um, I am doing this, I didn't mean to seem rude, but they were postdocs when I was doing my PhD, so we didn't have as much interaction with them. But I wish I had. I think like, the couple times I talked to the lady, I was in a bad mood, and I didn't get to foster that friendship as much as I would have loved to. But it was neat, especially being in an international, my campus, I was the only American, a lot of times I was the only American on my little campus. And University of Melbourne is huge. I was at Burnley campus, which is it's like 3 miles out from there. It's a botanic garden. And so I was the only American on that campus, but we had, the Chinese, the Iranians, um, a couple of Australians, a couple of English people, a whole bunch of Germans and Italians. And it was cool. It was cool to share. It was cool to, get others' perspectives. And then I also took it upon myself as a native English speaker to really kind of be there for my colleagues. I felt that was super important. And I think that kind of helped ingrain some of the friendships. And that would be, I guess, another thing is this whole being supportive thing is where that comes from. We ran English lessons like once a week in my office. Like I would have 10 Chinese students and we would talk about the correct enunciation of different things, or like how to say, like I can't tell you how many people were looking at the way my tongue hit the back of my teeth so that we could enunciate things correctly, or word usage, or reading people's papers who, again, English isn't their first language and they didn't have a supervisor who was willing to do the reading of the stuff for them. And I would never ask anything in return for most of those students. A couple of those folks are like some really good friends of mine. But I was willing to do that for most of the students there because I wanted to see everyone be successful. And so I think that that's, just again, a super important thing. And I don't recall anyone else of your interviews, of the couple that I've watched, mention that, but I think it's really important. It was something, and that's just how I am in general, but I think it's just super important. And I think that the environment could be better for students, and maybe we would have less lonely people, or maybe we would have, people who realize that, if their supervisor's an ass, but everyone else in the lab is supportive, then, maybe they don't have those dark thoughts,
Yes.
and take that option, which is an option, unfortunately,
Yeah. No, but this support system part, and starting from food and everything, supporting each other, seeing each other successful, I think this is how we used to be. But since now it is this rat race, everyone wants some stupid stuff or piece of it at least, and that's why we have done this. But again, going back to the basics, that breaking the barrier is one of the things. But if we have created this monstrous image of researchers in general audience, we are going to change that also. And that was one of the reasons having this series. So now, keeping the time in there, we'll say to all the audience that stay tuned for another episode of Researcher Celebrity. And with this, we will say thank you very much, Jesse, that sharing your journey, and I'm sure motivating so many of them to pursue their research, and some of them might to say bye to it.
Yeah. 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 And if you have to, you have to. There's no shame in it. Like and don't get me wrong, you'll have those feelings of inadequacy when you're having those thoughts. And I know that I wasn't alone, because academic Twitter has plenty of people who went through the same feelings. And I just, again, want to put out there, if you have to leave academia, you're not a failure. You're not a failure. There's only so much room. They're pumping too many out of us. It doesn't mean anything. It just means that that's not where you're supposed to be. Go find your other adventure. And it might take you a while. It's taken me a while to land. But that's all part of the journey. And you have the skills, and, drive on. It's the way it goes. And enjoy life. Always take time to enjoy life.
We enjoyed our conversation with you, Jessie. Thank you very, very, very much for your time.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for inviting me. This was really it was really quite a surprise because I have left academia and I was just like, oh, a researcher? You're still gonna call me a researcher?
Yes. Once forever. You were now and will always be called as researchers, and especially after having researcher celebrity tag on you. So with this, we'll say to all the audience that if you want to get some more conversation with Jessica, please feel free to write to her. If you want Empowering Science Foundation to put you in touch with our researcher celebrities, write it to us and then we'll bridge you. And only thing which we'll say, enjoy whatever you are doing. If research excites you, it is for you. Thank you very much, Jessie.
Thank you. Have a good night.